Hey everybody, welcome back to another TD Wood Customs video. In this video you're going to see me build an ash bar top and make a few mistakes along the way. Check it out. So I got these slabs from some private property that we have access to in southern Colorado. The owner passed away from cancer like 8-10 years ago maybe. He had his degree actually in forestry. He was super connected to the woods. He hunted, loved to fish, loved to woodwork. So we know his daughter really well, and she said that she was never going to get any use out of these amazing ash pieces that they had in the shed. So she was completely fine with us taking them off her hands. So I took them, brought them to get planed, and they turned out amazing. I mean, they are a little bit past great condition. There was some rot I had to get rid of, and you can see me using the Dremel and a dull chisel to get that live edge off. So the purpose of this piece is I'm making a ash bar top. So I'm going to remove all the rot and fill the voids with epoxy. Here I'm using my Mafell track saw. The guide rails are super nice, super straight. This piece only required one of the F160 guide rails. You can see I'm using the Mafell clamp below. Those are really expensive. You can get a much cheaper set from Dual. I'll have everything I use linked below. Gonna cut a straight edge on that side. That's gonna go up against the wall, and then have live edge on the other side. So the saw is a Mafell K85. I've loved it. It does super deep cuts. It'll do this ash very easily in one pass. I made a separate video on that saw that you can watch. I'll have it linked up above. Even though this Mafell just eats at that wood, I always still go really slow. You don't want it to overwork the saw or anything. So here you can see me. I'm going back because one of the sides had an extra crack on it. So I decided to, instead of take more material off of the edge that was good, I decided to take more material off of the edge that had a big crack in it. So I kind of show that here. To clean up the live edge, I use my first use a chisel, and then I use the Dremel a little bit. But you want to give it that natural look still. So I use my sander a little bit, but everybody kind of does live edge differently. I don't have like a wire wheel or anything like that. But that sander, it doesn't really take off too much and leave a weird pattern, so I just hit it with the sander quick on a low grit. Putting in a little plank. I don't really call it a bow tie, but just a little ash plank to match the wood. There's a crack right there that you can see, so I'm clamping it down here to keep it in place for my marking knife. You can also just like use CA glue and painter's tape, but have a nice sharp marking knife that makes this process really easy. I've done it with like X-Acto knives or anything or something like that, like a box cutter, and it doesn't work near as well. I found for whatever reason, it just goes along that edge super well, so it leaves a nice deep cut in it. So definitely label which side goes up. I've made the mistake in not knowing which side I had on the top, so I labeled, put a 1 on the plank and put a 1 on the table, and I won't lose where it's at. So I'm going to use my Dual router to dig out some of that material in there first, and then come back with the chisels. Definitely have a firm grip on the router. If it gets away from you, it can ruin that spot for sure. I couldn't really see the pencil line too well on this ash, so right inside of that line I came back with the Sharpie, and when you're using the router it's much easier to see, so definitely recommend that. Even if you can't see it somewhere well, that Sharpie just really sticks out. All right, now I'm coming back with the chisels. I don't listen to my own recommendations. Sometimes I need to just sharpen these up a little bit more, and I don't, so this took a little bit longer. I just need to get the grinder out and get some sharper edges. I also have just like super cheap chisels. I bought like 20 chisels off of Facebook Market from this old guy, and just sharpened them up like crazy right when I got them. And so, I mean, they're strong, they're tough, but they require quite a bit of sharpening. So eventually I'll get a nice Japanese set, but I'm just not there yet. All right, now I'm just filling that pocket with Titebond 3, and I'll also just paint it on the little ash plank that's going in there. If you use epoxy, it'll definitely show a little ring around it, so wood glue basically is seamless. knock that in there with a hammer, and then come back and just clamp it down. That gets it all tight in there snug. Then I don't touch these for at least 24 hours. I let them sit. You can see me, I'm painting in that wood glue edge, and then I'm going to come back with just sawdust that was in my sander. So there's some ash, there's probably a little bit of walnut. So I start by removing the material with a planer, and then come back with a sander and make it all nice and smooth. All right, so what you see me doing here is I had this crazy idea of putting a small shed that we found in this piece, and I'm gonna fill those voids with clear epoxy so you can kind of see that shed like floating in there. I decided against it in the end just because I haven't done like too many clear epoxy pours yet, but you can see I'm trying to like see how I can fit that antler in there. I eventually decided against it, but I could see myself going back down this route for a different piece someday. I kept working on these little voids. It was really hard to tell when the rot wood turned to better, harder wood. So I kind of kept taking off more. Ideally, I didn't want these big voids in the piece, but I felt like if I wanted to get that epoxy on good hardwood, that I needed to keep taking it away. So the voids got bigger and bigger, but I was happy with how they turned out in the end with that clear epoxy. So here's my I didn't make a ton of mistakes on this project actually compared to some of my past videos, just learning. But here I made a big mistake, and that was using Tyvek tape for a void this big. In hindsight, I almost got away with it. There was just one piece that epoxy leaked right out of. So if I would have made a little bit bigger barrier of tape around the edges, it would have worked. Because you can see I put a 2x4 in there to support the tape, so it wasn't like the weight of the epoxy wasn't like basically bowing out the Tyvek tape. So it almost worked. It just, that epoxy, if there's any opening, any gap in that tape, it'll find its way out and leak basically the whole thing out. So the interesting part is after I pour this, getting that piece all level, something that a lot of YouTubers might not go into depth explaining is you want this piece like super level. If it's off at all, like you will have that epoxy lean a certain way. So have that piece perfectly level both ways. That'll help you out after you make the pour. So I'm using a super clear liquid glass epoxy here. This is actually the first time I've used it. I've used Total Boat in the past, but I've heard that it's just super clear after it cures, and it's super good for like deep pour stuff. This piece here I think was close to 1.5 inches, so not super deep by any means. I did it in one pour, no problem. But this is me showing my mistake pour still. So mixing it up a ton with that epoxy bit, and also scraping the edges. It's definitely tougher to see where it's not mixed if you don't use a black dye like I have in the past. The black dye, it kind of shows the clear edges. But with the when it's clear epoxy, you got to really make sure to scrape those edges, because it does look mixed when it might not be. So after a couple minutes of mixing, I am making the pour here, and I get some set, and then I'll stop, hit it with the blowtorch quick to pop those first bubbles. Go back, pour more, pop, pour the final bit. So I kind of already spoiled what happens next, and that's basically that whole void leaked all the way out. There's no stopping it. Once that Tyvek tape gets wet with epoxy on the sticky side, I mean, it's game over. So, but the interesting thing is, I mean, it didn't leak for the first 45 minutes. I thought I was in the clear. I was pumped. I come back in the garage and it was all over the floor. So now I've got a epoxy floor in that spot, but that's okay. Here I'm doing the correct thing and making the circle of caulk, and then putting MDF covered in Tyvek tape, because I didn't have mold release at the time. So I covered the bottom side with Tyvek tape, pushing it down to get a good seal, and then I go one step further, and then I caulk around the edges of that. So if that seal didn't work out perfect, now I'm for sure I'm not going to have any issues with leaking, and I didn't. So took the time there, and it helped. So after that dried, I let it dry for it's supposed to be like water resistant after 30 minutes, but I let it go a couple hours, and here I am mixing up the second batch after the first one ended up on the floor, using the yellow stir stick and the red epoxy drill bit. So right away, like I did have a lot of bubbles, and I'm still learning how to get a good bubble-free epoxy, especially when it's clear. When it's black, it's obviously not near as obvious. So I'm painting on the edges, trying to get some bubbles to release off the edges. And with the super clear epoxy, bubbles slowly do pop out. But yeah, I'm still trying to figure out how to get those bubbles out of the epoxy, because it's obvious, like when you stir the epoxy, when you use that drill bit, I even used it on a pretty slow setting. I mean, there's still tons of micro bubbles in there. So I know people use like those pressure things that get bubbles out. So I'm still learning here. Leave a comment if you have like an awesome trick for that clear epoxy and getting bubbles out. Table must not have been perfectly level because it started to shift that way. And what I should have done in the first part is make a dam with that caulk, but I didn't do that. I came back like 30 minutes later and made it because I was leaving, and I didn't want a disaster on my hands if I didn't make a dam. So I put a dam around it, and that ended up holding in some epoxy. But here I am cutting away that MDF. We're gonna see how it turned out. Came off pretty easy with that Tyvek tape, and it looks great right away. I'm really happy with it. You can see that caulking made a nice barrier, kept it all in, getting that chisel under there. So no leaks with the MDF and caulk. I was pretty happy with that. Next, I'm just removing as much of that caulking as I can. I'm going to take it to a hardwood shop, and they've got a big 50-inch sander that I've used before on my walnut table, but they took it down to about 1.25 inches, making it all flat and smooth with that epoxy. So here, that's already been done, and I'm beginning to wet sand that clear epoxy. I didn't show any of the dry sanding yet. I got this table up to 220, and then I came back with wet or dry sandpaper, and I ended up using it wet. And what I did is I bought 800 grit, 1000 grit, and 1500 grit, and I put water on the epoxy and then just sanded away, moving from 800 to 1500, and I was super happy. It definitely started to lift the sheen, even though after 1500 it's still quite matte. So after I had it sanded up to 1500 grit, it was time to buff it. So I tried to find like the 3M buffing car compound, but I couldn't find any at Home Depot, and I didn't want to wait for all this shipping because I needed to finish up this piece. So what I ended up getting is this car compound. I forget the brand. I'll have it linked below, but it ended up working out well. I've never used it before. This is the first time I've actually ever buffed anything in my life. I was really happy. I just had it on this little spinning wheel that I bought as a nice bit for the drill, and buffed it on there a couple times, and it ended up working out. It made a very clear finish, which I'll show you in the end. So had it all the way sanded up to 1500 with that wet sandpaper, and I was really happy how it turned out. I'm going to do a separate video on this buffing because there's not a lot out on YouTube, and these are all things I just purchased from Home Depot. So I feel like for the DIY guy or gal at home, this worked out really well for me. So I'm going to share my secret there. You can see it's already starting to clear up quite a bit after that compound's on there. So I was really happy with how glossy and clear it ended up turning out. All right, so after I messed with all the epoxy and shined it up a little bit, I sanded, did some final last touches with the dry sanding, and then it was ready to I was ready to apply the finish. So I ended up getting this table up to 220, and I'm using Rubio Monocoat 2C Smoke 5% is the color that I'm using. There's actually a lot of people don't realize there's tons of different color options at Rubio Monocoat. I've used their original, which is called Pure. I've used that on darker pieces, but I wanted to try out this Smoke. I've seen it used on oak pieces, and I love the look, so I'm gonna try it here on the ash. One thing I noticed is from like the Pure Rubio Monocoat I've used in the past, this I obviously have I poured too much down there, but it wasn't as thick as the Rubio Monocoat Pure that I used. I'm not sure why. Maybe it was just needed to mix up the Rubio in the container a little bit more, but it definitely seemed more watery. But I troweled it around, and then I let it sit for a couple minutes and let it really soak into that wood, especially because some of that wood is a little bit softer In places, I really just let that Rubio soak into it for a couple minutes, and then wipe it all in super well, get all the edges, and make sure there's no excess remaining. Then I always love doing 2 coats with Rubio Monocoat, even though they advertise and say you can do it all in one, which you can. It gets good protection in one, but I go back with this maroon pad and basically sand off a little bit. That maroon pad, I usually use like a used one. So I think that maroon pad is around 320 to 400 grit. But I use a used one that's maybe closer up to 500, and I just go along it and get basically nice dusty film on it, and then spray it all off with the air compressor. And that's basically all I do. I don't go back with mineral spirits. They say they don't recommend mineral spirits, obviously, because they don't manufacture mineral spirits, so it's kind of a marketing thing there, in my opinion. I've used mineral spirits before and no issues at all with the Rubio Monocoat, but here I'm doing that second coat, letting it sit. It's really important to wipe that Rubio off really well. You might think it's all wiped off, but if you keep coming back with a white cloth, lint-free cloth, you can always pull more off. So after you've let it sit for a while, just keep coming back, and it's a hard wax finish, so you should feel it shouldn't slide like glossy. It should definitely have some resistance from the hard wax, and definitely just make sure you pull off any excess along the live edge, along the other side. And hopefully you learned some things in this video. Here's the final look of that ash bar top. It's a super cool look. Like I said earlier, all the products I've used are linked below. You can find links to the Rubio, to the stuff I use to polish, all those things. Until then, you can check me out on Instagram at tdwoodcustoms, and my website www.tdwoodcustoms.com. Thanks for watching.